Good morning, all, and hopefully you're staying warm. My name is Douglas Hemphill. I am one of the campus instructional designers, along with Carrie Mocyk, who is also on today. And today's current session is making life easier with the Date Manager tool. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and can everybody see that okay? So, as most of you are probably aware, Brightspace has the ability to use dates to control visibility for students. Those dates can be on everything from your announcements, uh, sorry, uh, on everything to your announcements to the content in your course, including the content that is presented to students or the content that is meant to assess students. Now, normally that sort of date hiding will show up in the actual assignment. So I can see in this assignment, becomes available, it will be available until October 30th, 2022. Obviously, this is a bit of an older one, and it was also due on October 2022, 11:59. Now, I could go through and manually change these by just clicking on the date, and you can see I can add a start date, I can change the due date, and I can change the end date. However, that's not really all that efficient. So I'm here to show you a great tool that lets you handle this much, much faster. So if you go into course tools on your course and scroll down and find course admin, in this list of tools, you will see something called Manage Dates. And if we go ahead and click on this, this literally shows everything in the course that can potentially have a date on it. So announcements, assignments, content, etc., etc. And it is all listed right here. Now, initially, this can be a little bit overwhelming, but I do like using this view of everything as a way to just scan my dates. So this is sort of jumping ahead, but once I've done all of my dates, I can scan through really easily and say, okay, yeah, this is 2024, this is 2024. Hey, wait, here's a date from 2022. Well, that's not right. I need to adjust that. And all I have to do is click on it, and I can change my start date and my end date. I can also add dates. I just have to click this little dash, and now I have the ability to add a due date to it. And it also has a nice little column that says, okay, you've got a start date and an end date. Well, here's how long it will be visible to students. So that's sort of also a self-check. Is something really supposed to be available to students for 800 days? That might be a little longer than necessary. Now you will notice that you also have this visibility column. That simply tells you whether something is currently visible to students. So you can see assignment 1 is hidden from students. I cannot change whether something is actually hidden from here, but it tells me potentially, hey, I didn't mean for that to be hidden. I need to go find that. In which case I just click on the title. So in this case, it takes me right to assignment 1. I can unhide that and save it. And then I can go right back to my course tools and my course admin and my manage dates. So it's not quite as convenient as being able to adjust it right in the interface, but it still does really give you that option to jump right to it and adjust the settings as you need to. But again, this can be a little overwhelming because, again, this is everything that in the course that can possibly have a date. So it's often useful at the very top to edit things, or sorry, to filter things. So I have this option to filter by tool, and I can just change this to specific tools. And in this case, I'm just going to look at all of my assignments. So these are drop boxes, places where I can submit papers, basically. And go ahead and apply filter. And now I am only seeing my assignments. So this makes it much easier for me to manage my assignments, specifically if I'm tweaking stuff for a new semester. So I know everything is in 2024, so I'm just going to tweak those dates. I do also have a bulk date editor. That's this check mark up here. So this will select everything. Now, bulk edit dates you usually won't want to use because it actually will set all the dates the same. So if I were to go into that and say, oh, well, I just want to edit my dates. Well, now it would change everything that's selected to January 18th. And that's not usually useful. It can be useful if you've got everything open and you're trying to find everything in module 1. But more often, I think what you'll find useful is bulk offset dates. So let's say I know that everything is going from 2023 to 2024. Well, I'm going to select all those dates that I've got check marked, and I'm just going to move them forward, let's say 180 days. You may need to do a little bit of math in your head. There are websites that will also do this for you to say, well, but if I want to move everything that started in September to January, how many days is that? But you just say, I want to move everything forward that number of days. And it's going to think for a sec. And now these were originally 2022 dates, but now they're 2023 dates. But it's a way to bulk move everything forward however far you need it to do, whether that's moving it forward 3 months from one semester to the next or moving it 1 year forward. And then it's a little easier to tweak the dates because ideally everything will be in the right year. So you just kind of have to worry about tweaking your days and your months. So that is the general basics of the tool. I do want to talk about a couple of quick tweaks. One is if you go to discussions in Brightspace do not have the ability for due dates. So if you go to discussions, you will see all of your due dates are not applicable. And that is simply because of the fact that discussions don't work with due dates. The other thing to notice in discussions is that you have both your forums and your topics. If you're not familiar with how discussions work in Brightspace, the forms are basically baskets for you to put the topics into. They're an organizational tool. We don't make heavy use of them, but simply because of how our system is configured. But the thing is if a form is hidden, the settings for the form will override the settings for the topic. So my recommendation tends to be make sure that your forms don't have any start or end dates, and that all of your start and end dates are at the topic level. And hopefully that makes sense. The other thing is that depending on what tool you are working with, you'll see some extra options on the date manager. So for example, this is a discussion topic. So this is where students would go to participate in a discussion. When I click start date, yes, I have my start and end date, but I have a couple of extra options. I can make it simply visible with access before start. This is the default. What this means is that students will be able to see essentially the title that says, hey, there's a discussion on this date. Here's when it will start. Here's when it will end. But they aren't able to go in it. The second option is that they will be able to go in and look at the question itself that's posted in the discussion, but they won't be able to actually submit to the discussion forum. And last is the more traditional hidden, which for those of you that lived through the Blackboard era, this was more how Blackboard worked. So students simply don't see it until the start date, and on the start date, it magically appears. I tend to find that the first option works quite well for start dates in terms of it's nice for students to know what's going to be coming up. End dates is where I would consider whether you want to change it to visibility with submission restriction, because what this does is it cuts off submissions for the discussion forum, but it allows students to go in after the discussion is over and review their post, read other student posts, and generally potentially catch up on stuff that they missed. Maybe I didn't have as much time as I thought, and I want to go back and read more posts, or the ability to go back and review those posts after the fact. This is pretty specific to discussion topics in terms of this visible with submission restrictions. But the other options do affect things like assignments and whatnot. So do I want an assignment to be visible with access restrictions so that students can see that it's coming up? Do I want them to be able to see the assignment but not submit it, or do I just want it to appear? And depending on your instructional use case, all three of those can potentially be relevant. Let me just check one other thing, and you will see you can select multiple filters. If you want to look at all of your assignments, you could look all of your assessments, you could look at your assignments, your discussions, and your quizzes all together. If there's a reason you want to do that, just want to, damn it. So yeah, you see the same options, but just understand that they work a little bit differently when you're using something like an assignment. Visibility with submission restricted in the case of an assignment will just let a student go in and read what the assignment instructions were, but it's not really as useful as it is with a discussion because you don't have anything else to look at other than the original assignment instructions. So that wraps up what I was going to say. Are there any questions?
Hey Doug, sorry for my lateness.
Not a problem. I
I
barely got
tried
here
do
on
I
time due
tried
to
do
computer
yeah,
issues.
I tried doing this last week and following, multiple series of directions. And where it always said, see under due date, it says, click on that little line. I always had an NA there. So
That
I
is
could,
specific to discussions.
I'm sorry, say that
Um,
again.
that is specific to discussions.
So I can't
Uh,
change the discussion dates.
well, so very specifically, discussions in Brightspace do not allow for the use of due dates.
I
So those will always be NA. That if you're seeing it anywhere other than for discussions, let me know.
okay.
But yeah, it's one of those little oddities that they don't allow due dates for discussions.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I see who's on here, so I'm gonna jump in. Sorry, Michelle and Megan and Naja. I'm the beta test person for APHIS, the evaluation assessment system on campus. And that's a system that's going to pull in data from Brightspace to the APHIS system for program and course, whatever assessment. And again, the discussion thing, it just drives me nuts. Doesn't show up as important to pull in. So and I use discussions. Those are my like 40% of my grade many times. And they're very, very important and they have to be done professionally and citations and demonstrate knowledge. And yet these vendors kind of blow it off like it's a BS session. I don't know.
That one I can't comment
I
on
know.
simply because APHIS isn't in my
I
wheelhouse.
know. I know. I'm just throwing that in that this whole discussion part is because the checklist has been beautiful because I can now put the discussion post in the checklist and it shows up in the calendar for the student because the discussion reply will show up in the calendar, but the post never did. So that's been a nice feature.
Yeah, and I can't even comment as to why they don't have due dates for discussions. Uh that's just how the system was set up, and I don't have that predates any SUNY involvement with it, and I simply don't have any insight into why it was designed that way. But yes, the checklist is a way to get around that, and for what it's worth, oh, I stopped sharing my screen, but the specific under the filter by tool and the specific tool, you can access your checklists as well. So you can adjust the date, any dates that are attached to your checklist through the manage dates tool as well. For what that's worth. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, that is the end of this session. I will see anyone who wishes to in another 10 minutes.